Hello, everyone. My name is Sikho Luthango, and I am the Senior Research Associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership Africa. Today, we are joined by Amma Adu, who is a management consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. Amma is focusing particularly on energy and primarily on the just energy transition. And she is also part of the Knowledge Partner team and supporting the B20 Energy Mix and Just Transition Task Force. In our conversation with Amma, we've covered a couple of things, including the importance of supply chain resilience in a very volatile geopolitical context. We also covered the importance, therefore, in this context of regional industrialization. And finally, the challenges of financing a just energy transition, especially for emerging development economies. This is our third episode of our G20 podcast series, and thank you so much for joining us. Amma, thank you for joining us on our G20 podcast series. I want you to elaborate exactly what the B20 is and what BCG's role is within the broader context of the B20.
Yeah, happy to. So the B20 is essentially an engagement partner that's involved in the overall G20 process. So once a year, the host country, and it's being hosted by South Africa this year, will host the overall G20. And then there are a whole host of engagement bodies. So you have the B20, which is the body that I'm involved on. There is the, Women 20, Youth 20, Think Tank 20, a whole host of engagement groups. And the B20 is essentially one of those, firmly focused on the business environment or business input into the overall B20 process. So as a knowledge partner, we support on that engagement group. And within that engagement group, there are I think there are about 8 other task forces that are also involved. So, this year there is the Trade and Investment Task Force, Energy Mix and Just Transition Task Force, Finance and Infrastructure, and a whole host of others. I support primarily on the Energy Mix and Just Transition Task Force, which is chaired by Daniel Minele this year from Nedbank. And as, knowledge partners, which is the body that I support on, we essentially support in crafting the overall policy paper, which is the ultimate deliverable of the task force, as well as advocating for the various recommendations that might come out of the policy paper itself. And then these recommendations will feed up into the G20 and hopefully reflected in the final leaders' declaration. So I think that gives a bit of a flavor on what the overall process is like.
I also understand, Amma, that you have a policy paper process, and thereafter you also have an advocacy phase. Can you just elaborate on what essentially these phases entail? And also, as a network partner and beyond being a network partner, how other stakeholders can support you in the process?
Yes, happy to. So the policy paper process is really the first and perhaps the most important part of the overall B20. And what we do in that is we really do a bit of a deep dive into what are some of the global, issues or considerations that are coming across in our relevant task force. So on the energy side, what is the host country's objective this year as it relates to that particular topic? And then we also look at what are the focus areas for the next presidency, which will be taking over next year. And I think now it's going to be the US, as well as what the focus areas were in the previous presidency. So we collate all of those thematic ideas and come up with a couple of recommendations that we think should be pushed in this year's policy paper. Once we have a bit of a view on what those high-level recommendations are, we start to engage with a whole host of experts internally, within our knowledge partner team, as well as external experts such as yourselves, Cambridge, and all of these various experts feed into the policy paper itself. And we also have broader discussions with task force members from across the globe, and they also feed into the overall discussion and help craft some of the policy actions and give a bit more flavor to the overall recommendation itself. And at the end of this, quite iterative process, we land on a very firm policy paper document that really speaks to the voice of business within the energy community and really calls for specific actions that we want to be championed at the G side. So that's the overall policy paper, and that's the main deliverable. So once we've crafted and finalized that overall deliverable, we have the responsibility of advocating for it, as in making sure that it does land in the G20 somehow within the leader statement. And that involves, attending various events, probably hosting events, media engagements, and quite targeted bilaterals with relevant counterparts from the G side so that we can effectively deposit the recommendations to the G20. So that's the overall process. And then once the recommendations are deposited, hopefully it comes out in a leader statement. And then those recommendations will be the priority of, the various G20 countries moving forward, and they'll just prioritize them in terms of the overall energy environment moving forward. And then we hand over to the US, and the US will follow a similar process.
So, Amma, in our previous podcast, we covered with Dr. Melanie Mueller the impacts of this year's G20 occurring in a very volatile geopolitical context. And I want us to focus specifically on the impact it has on supply chain resilience. What are the impacts of what we've seen as rising protectionism and tariffs on inputs on building African supply chains? And maybe you can elaborate which supply chains will be most affected in the near term and how this can also be mitigated.
Yeah. So, rising protectionism has the effect of just increasing the overall cost of key energy inputs, such as solar panels, batteries, even steel and grid components. And for many African countries that rely heavily on inputs, these trends are, deepening existing supply chain vulnerabilities and limiting their ability to scale their energy transition infrastructure. I think the most immediate bottlenecks probably include limited regional manufacturing capacity for green energy technologies, leading to heavy reliance on external suppliers, inadequate transport and logistics infrastructure, which slows delivery, further raises costs and weakens project implementation timelines, as well as fragmented technical standards across markets. And, to really address some of these challenges, several actions that are a little bit critical, but I'm just going to highlight two today. One is we really need to deepen regional coordination on trade policy, industrial strategy, and infrastructure planning, particularly through shared energy corridors and integrated supply chain hubs that serve multiple countries. And then secondly, we really need to have a big push for investing in local value chains, right, with clear and consistent industrial policy signals that reduce investor uncertainty, as well as encourage private sector participation in manufacturing, processing, and logistics, all of the various components that are required to ensure a strong industrial base.
And Amo, having worked close with you on the policy paper, one of the recommendations that you highlighted in the paper is the development of downstream manufacturing in a couple of countries in Africa. What would you highlight as some of the recommendations that you've made, which developing economies can take to move beyond raw extraction and more towards midstream and downstream value chain activities?
Yeah. So to just take a step back, despite holding vast reserves of critical minerals essential to the energy transition, many emerging and developing economies still remain limited to raw material extraction, as you rightly underscore. And as a result, they continue to miss out on higher value opportunities associated with mineral processing, component manufacturing, and energy technology development. And in order to shift this pattern and capture more domestic value, these countries must strengthen the foundations of industrial development. This includes, as I kind of alluded to the previous question, investing in infrastructure, building regional manufacturing ecosystems, as well as equipping the workforce with the technical skills that are required by the clean energy transition. Just to be a bit more concrete, so some actions would be, developing clean energy industrial zones to co-locate manufacturing, logistics, research and development while attracting both domestic and international investment. That's one. Another is perhaps to leverage public procurement and export promotion to incentivize local manufacturing of strategic energy technologies, such as solar panels, batteries, as well as grid components. And finally, I think the policy paper also calls for facilitating technology access and transfer, right? So this includes through global cooperation on intellectual property, voluntary licensing, and open innovation platforms that enable emerging producers to scale up the manufacturing. And, kind of lastly, in parallel, emerging markets do need to prioritize skills development, right, and technology standard alignment to meet the quality and regulatory expectations of global markets.
And just on your point about skills development, Amam, The paper also cites that there is a potential for about 38 million clean energy jobs in emerging development economies by 2050. What has been highlighted in the paper as some of the most critical skills gaps today? How can the G20 and local partners best coordinate to scale green skilling programs?
Yeah. So the energy transition presents a major employment opportunity, as you rightly underscore. But realizing that potential depends on how quickly countries can build skilled and future ready workforces. And some of the skills gaps that we're seeing is in a couple of areas. So one is around electrical and systems engineering, especially for battery storage, grid integration, and distributed energy systems. Another is installation and maintenance, right, of the various solar panels, wind, and other renewable energy infrastructure that might be required. Manufacturing and assembly of clean energy components also stands out. Inverters, panels, etc. So the manufacturing skills that are required there are a bit lacking. And then finally, digital and data capabilities, which are essential for smart grid development, system monitoring, and energy efficiency solutions are also quite lacking. And really, to address these gaps, we call for an ecosystem based approach to workforce development. And this includes, training to employment pipelines that link public institutions, industry partners, and vocational partners to real jobs. We also call for regional skilling frameworks, and mutual certification standards that allow trained workers to move where demand is growing fastest across borders in some cases. And finally, integration of skilling strategies with national energy transition and industrial developments. And I think a leading example, at the risk of sounding jingoistic, is South Africa's Just Energy Transition Skilling for Employment program. So this combines local job placement with inclusive training programs that are responsive to private sector needs. And this kind of model we think should be adopted as we think about the overall skills program under the Just Energy Transition.
And you mentioned the expansion of grid capacity regionally and across the continent. And in one of your recommendations, you have called for a digitized, resilient grid and also a streamlined permitting system. What innovations have you grappled with in the paper or pilot projects which have shown promise in reducing permitting timelines, but at the same time ensuring that there is safeguard of environmental protections, including biodiversity and also social standards?
Yeah. So several on the ground examples show that infrastructure permitting and energy system build out can be significantly accelerated without compromising environmental and social safeguards by using digital tools and coordinated planning. So in India, the National Smart Grid Mission has deployed advanced metering infrastructure, digitized grid operations, and introduced automated planning tools that have improved project execution greatly. Also in Kenya and Ethiopia, we see digitized systems planning, including the use of climate risk and land use data. And this is being applied to geothermal energy development. So there's a lot of on the ground, examples that we can call on or leverage. And what we really think is that to scale some of the success that we see in these benchmarks, G20 members need to support really the development of automated permitting platforms, the development of regional grid monitoring and data sharing systems, as well as integration of climate smart infrastructure planning standards tailored to the emerging economy context. And, with the right combination of technology, governance, as well as community engagement, infrastructure delivery can be faster, it can be more resilient, and most importantly, it can be more socially responsive.
So, Amma, in the context of the just transition, it is quite a cross-cutting goal, and yet there are a number of risks, especially those that are associated with job displacement. Which social protection or retaining policies have proven most effective in fossil fuel dependent regions, and how can they be scaled in emerging developing economy contexts?
Yeah, sure. So, as you underscore, so the just energy transition is really a fundamental development priority, especially in regions that risk economic displacement because they're highly dependent on fossil fuels. And again, the same example kind of, rings true. This is on the JET SEP. This initiative really links retaining and income support directly to employment pathways in renewable energy, sustainable fuels, and other transition-aligned industries. And it's designed as a demand-driven model, aligning worker skills with real economic opportunity, while also supporting local enterprise development and job displacement. So it ensures that the transition is not just about replacing jobs, but really about building long-term livelihoods. It also includes strong mechanisms on youth participation, gender inclusion, and coordination between public and private sectors. And scaling similar models across EMDs will require a bit of a dedicated just transition financing windows, particularly under national energy and industrial strategies. It also will require integration of skilling, retraining, and social protection into broader transition planning. Also does require support for MSMEs, cooperatives, and informal workers to participate in these new value chains. And finally, requires community engagement mechanisms that give voice to affected workers and regions. I mean, ultimately, a truly just transition is one where the social and economic benefits of the energy transition are shared deliberately and equitably with those most at risk of being left behind.
Amma, in your previous question, you mentioned the importance of community engagement. And I mean, what we've seen in the African context is the increasing resistance around project expansion, especially those that have negative or potential consequences on the environment or on human rights. Is this something you grapple with in the policy paper?
Once again, in the overall policy paper, we look towards examples that we've seen as it relates to rolling out of some sort of just energy transition. Obviously, naturally, when it comes to any type of economic transformation, there will be, some sort of assistance and, reform that's probably required in specific areas in order to get the overall ecosystem to, to transform and really unlock some of that additional opportunity that's available. And to do that, you really do need a people-centered and community-focused approach, i.e. engaging with, the relevant stakeholders, the relevant community leaders in the areas that may be affected. And this needs to be done from the ground up. So you need to really take it from, in our overall policy paper, we shift from a top-down approach, which is quite prescriptive, to a bottom-up community-inclusive approach, and really call for some sort of flexibility in the overall design of the various solutions across the various regions that will be impacted. So it really does require very much an iterative mindset and a overall community engagement required mindset to kind of overcome some of these frictions. But I mean, the frictions are expected, as is the case with many, industrial transformations, but there is really a quite targeted way to address this. And I mean, if I just think about, Eskom Skomati, for example, there was a lot of community engagement there that was required. Obviously, all of these various transitions are not without their faults, and there are lots of learnings that are required there, but that's already nested in the overall, iterative community engagement feedback loops process. So, I mean, overall, long story short, there's no one size fits all solution to it. It does require deep community engagement and a people-centered approach to align on something that works for the broader society.
Now, going back to the needs of the just transition, or what the just transition needs to be fueled, is the question on finance. And your paper highlights that there is about a 2.5 to 3 trillion US dollar shortfall in annual climate finance flows to meet emerging development economy needs. Can you highlight some of the primary factors that you've highlighted in the paper that could be driving investors' risk perceptions in these markets? And how can they be most effectively addressed by the G20 as well?
Yeah. So the challenge of financing the energy transition in emerging markets is not only just about the amount of money. There is a structural issue, or a structural shift is required in financing systems in order to unlock the necessary capital. And I mean, in my opinion, the challenge is really threefold. And the investor perception probably links quite nicely into the first area, which is a volumes issue. There's high risk perception and limited mobilization of capital. Attracting the scale of finance required is difficult in the current environment. So as you underscore, many economies, many emerging economies sometimes have similar credit profiles to advanced economies, yet face higher borrowing costs. And this is largely driven as a result of investor perceptions on the macroeconomic instability of the area, perhaps currency volatility and regulatory uncertainty. And this is really made worse by the absence of effective de-risking mechanisms such as blended finance, local currency instruments, and first loss guarantees. And this further just disencourages private investment. So that's the volumes issue. Then there's just an overall flow issue. So sometimes where the finance is available, it too often fails to reach the right actors. So the flows remain fragmented and really difficult to access, particularly for local governments and, community-based organizations. So to improve these finance flows, you need more inclusive financing mechanisms, such as maybe an SME dedicated fund or local project preparation facilities. Additionally, country platforms can also play a strong role here because they can serve as a strategic coordination tool to align international and domestic finance with national priorities. And then finally, there's an overall destination issue. So, you have the volumes issue, you have a flow issue, and then you also have a destination issue. So there's limited bankable projects and early stage investment gaps that exist. So one of the major barriers to deployment is this shortage of investment ready projects. So many countries lack early stage capital, project preparation facilities, and technical capacity needed to move from concept to bankability. So there's really a push here to strengthen project pipelines. And this requires increasing investment in feasibility studies, pre-development assistance, as well as local delivery capacity. So, the overall financing issues is quite layered, and to really unlock the necessary capital at the scale that's required, you do kind of need to tackle all of the various elements. Starting with volumes, then flows, then destination, or you can do them all concurrently. The risk perception piece is really one of the biggest volume blockers that we're seeing.
And Amma, you mentioned country platforms. What have been the biggest challenges in moving country platforms, like, for example, the South Africa's Just Energy Transition, the JETP, from planning to implementation? And how can these lessons inform future country platform design and ensure that this is something that the G20 can actually take forward?
So country platforms themselves are designed to align national priorities with international finance by bringing together public institutions, development partners, as well as private sector actors under one coordinated investment framework. South Africa's JETP is often cited as a, first-generation country platform with global visibility, but it's also, given as a case study in the structure and operational challenges that must be overcome by country platforms. And I think for me, there are two key ones that reign true. The first is around, fragmented governance and unclear institutional mandates. In South Africa's case, there was oftentimes overlapping responsibilities among national departments and partners, and this created friction and ambiguity on who does when, where, and how. The second is around just overall delayed mobilization at early stage finance. So while pledges were made, the distribution of technical assistance and, preparatory capital to develop bankable projects was often slow and perhaps also poorly sequenced. And to really overcome some of these structural challenges, we call for one, legal and policy anchoring. So the country platforms should be institutionalized as part of national policy frameworks, or at least formally codified in law, to ensure long-term regulatory stability, cross-ministerial alignment, and political continuity, in the hopes that this will help alleviate some of this fragmented governance and unclear institutional mandates challenge. Another one that we call for is really harmonized DFI access protocol. So country platforms should streamline and standardize application reporting and compliance processes across DFIs and MDBs, thus reducing transaction costs and increasing absorptive capacity as a way to kind of, again, mitigate against this delayed mobilization issue. And then, finally, country platforms do need to evolve beyond coordination platforms. They need to become execution-orientated investment systems, with a couple of features. So you need joint planning and ownership between government and DFIs. You also need monitoring and adaptive learning loops so that plans can evolve as implementation challenges arise and lessons accumulate. Again, really a push for this feedback loop element, but that's one of the best ways to create something that's quite solid into the future.
That brings us to the end of our podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sikho.